Does such a thing as the fatal flaw, that showy dark crack running down the middle of a life, exist outside literature? I used to think it didn't. Now I think it does. And I think that mine is this: a morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. À moi, l'histoire d'une de mes folies. What a way to start your debut novel. Welcome to the Politics of Fiction. I'm Darren. I look at literature through a political lens. Today we are talking about The Secret History by Donna Tartt. So I first read The Secret History as a pretentious teenager. I had studied ancient Greek and classics at school, and in some ways I was not unlike some of the characters, although less homicidal. So reading it again recently, just a few years later, I was happy to find that I loved it just as much this time around, and definitely got more out of it as well. I know that there's a lot of discourse around this book. There's been a lot written and said about it, and it has become kind of a signifier for a certain type of person as well. You know, it's part of the whole Southern Gothic scene. It's got the classical elements. It kind of kick-started that whole dark academia microgenre and all that other attendant stuff that's very online that most normal people are probably completely oblivious to. I wonder what that's like. Anyway, none of that should take away from the fact that this is a marvelous novel. So let's do a quick review before we get into the politics. We'll talk about the writing and the tone first, because the two are inseparable, I think. The writing in this book is wonderful. From the beginning, it just jumps off the page. It's arresting and it's beautifully put together. Tartt's prose is sometimes ornate and elegant, sometimes ethereal and dreamlike. It's always striking and expressive and aesthetically pleasing. Some of the sentences would make you groan with envy. Tartt is one of those authors for me where I'll just sit there shaking my head thinking, how can you do that with the English language? Her descriptive writing is rich and evocative. It gives the book a really tangible sense of place and atmosphere which pulls you in quite deeply. The tone is wry and ironic throughout, and I think it's a good representation of how seriously a kind of intellectual 20-year-old would take themselves. It's a dark and brooding book in many ways, but it's also very dryly funny at times. The voice of Richard as he narrates the book is captivating and sumptuous, and even if it's not believable that this character would sound like that, I mean, who cares? It's gorgeous to read. You could almost read that dissonance as a metatextual point about aesthetics, but we'll get into that later. Here's just a short extract. This is Richard talking about Henry and the others. They liked to wear pale clothes, particularly white. In this swarm of cigarettes and dark sophistication, they appeared here and there like figures from an allegory, or long-dead celebrants from some forgotten garden party. The character descriptions are excellent. Again, Tartt's writing here is deliberately showy, but not too pretentious. She somehow manages to make these people realistic, but also slightly exaggerated caricatures or archetypes, like you might find in a Greek play. The main characters are all very well drawn. I had a clear image in my head of each of them from the beginning of the book. Even the minor character descriptions are great, and sometimes with only one line, she'll really capture the essence of a certain type of person that you recognize. It reminded me of Kurt Vonnegut, who had that gift as well. For example, he was more like some gabby old codger who would sit next to you on a bus and try to show you bits of paper he kept folded in his wallet. And describing a couple who are friends with his parents, Mr. McNatt was an auto parts salesman. Mrs. McNatt was shaped like a pigeon and sold Avon. So I do think the writing is a bit stronger in the first half of the book, because the pace is more leisurely and the tone is more contemplative. We get Richard really taking his time, giving us his impressions of college life and the people he meets and everything. The second half of the book, the aftermath of the murder, is a bit more perfunctory. It's a bit more procedural, more of a series of events. and the writing is just a little less eye-catching, a bit more prosaic. For a debut novel, it's an incredibly accomplished piece of writing. It's skillfully woven, measured, precise, but never feels formulaic. Tartt is in complete control of the narrative at all times, and it's just one of those books where the author seems to have infused it with something slightly supernatural, something alluring, entrancing, an essence that's beyond academic analysis that just elevates it to another level. And reading the book is a wholly immersive experience. Every time you put the book down, you almost have to physically wrench yourself from this world that you've been inhabiting. The wet cobblestones, the dusty bookshelves, the willows, the fog, the dark campus corners, the Dionysian whispers, the jealousy and intrigue and passion and intellect and beauty. And you just have to wait a minute and feel like you're slowly being poured back into your real life. And then you pick it up again. So in terms of the plot of the book, I think the obvious comparison to make is to a Greek tragedy, and I think that's fitting. Even the way in which the story is told is quite dramatic and theatrical. It's not a murder mystery, it is the story of murder and its consequences. And that's not a spoiler, since the murder and the narrator's part in it is given away in the prologue of the book. So in true Greek style, the book starts off in the middle, in medias res. I still remember that phrase from school. So it starts on the cliff the night of the murder. Kind of like a 90s sitcom freeze frame. Yep, that's me, murdering a guy. You're probably wondering how I got here. Then we go back and we build up to the midpoint of the book, which is the murder in more detail. Then the second half is the aftermath, the consequences, the guilt, etc. To be honest, there's not much plot in the book apart from that. This book is really all about the characters. It's about the murder they commit and its effect on them. So let's talk about the characters. We'll talk about Henry and the gang first and then come around to Richard. Because the book is narrated by Richard, the others are his primary focus, Henry and the gang. So we learn about them from Richard's unreliable narration. So leaving Bunny aside for the moment, the gang is Henry, Francis, Charles and Camilla. The interesting thing for me is how compelling and even charming they seem, even though they are ultimately not very nice people, to put it mildly. There's a lot of humor in their depictions, like how they're so focused on intellect that they're completely clueless about practical things and cut off from the real world, especially Henry, who was shocked to learn about the moon landing, for example. And I did find myself with that feeling as I read, especially the first half of the book. I don't like these people, but I wish I could spend more time with them. I'd happily read more about their lives, their conversations, their studies, their awkward social interactions, their other murders, I guess. That's a bit weird, but that's great writing. And one of the great dichotomies in the book is the juxtaposition of this cozy, picturesque academic enclave with the horrific, blood-soaked, tragic events and the actions of the characters. Beauty and terror, which we'll come back to later. The second half of the book gets a bit of criticism, and it does flag a little bit at times. But I think it's very effective not only in showing us the effects of guilt, but also in peeling away the charms of Henry and the gang, and showing us and Richard the consequences of their ridiculous and barbaric actions. Remember that this is all from Richard's point of view. So the first half is all about the gang and how mysterious and intellectual they are, and the impressionable, romantic lens through which Richard sees them and himself. And then the second half is Richard gaining awareness of reality, even if that awareness doesn't really seem to have much of an effect on him. When we leave Richard at the end of the book, I immediately thought of the ending of American Psycho. And interestingly, Bret Easton Ellis is mentioned in the dedication to this book by Donna Tartt. So at the end of American Psycho, we have this quote from Patrick Bateman: "There are no more barriers to cross. All I have in common with the uncontrollable and the insane, the vicious and the evil, all the mayhem I have caused and my utter indifference toward it, I have now surpassed. My pain is constant and sharp, and I do not hope for a better world for anyone. In fact, I want my pain to be inflicted on others. I want no one to escape. But even after admitting this, and I have countless times in just about every act I've committed, and coming face to face with these truths, there is no catharsis. I gain no deeper knowledge about myself. No new understanding can be extracted from my telling. This confession has meant nothing." And that's the overriding sense that we get from Richard. There may be some remorse, some about the murder, some about being manipulated, but there is no catharsis. So what can we say about Richard as a character? Not much really, and that's the point. And we'll talk more about his passivity later when we discuss morality. So let's talk about Bunny, who is the murder victim. The most striking thing about him is, again, from what we're told by Richard, just how unlikable he is. He's boorish, selfish, bigoted, dishonest, manipulative. It's almost like we're being tempted into saying, well, maybe he deserved it, and sympathizing with the gang. And that's another reason why I think the second half of the book is so important. Later we see Bunny's family at the funeral, and yeah, they're a bit brutish and annoying, but they're also torn apart by grief, because a young man, a son, a brother, an uncle has been murdered. So the other characters in the book, we have Julian, the gang's teacher, a really interesting character that we'll talk more about later. And then there's a whole range of entertaining minor characters. The paranoid French professor, the absent-minded doctor, Cloak, the drug dealer, the two beer-swilling jock guys, the brilliantly named Judy Poovey. And like I said, Tartt's descriptions of them, which are both beautifully written and slightly tongue-in-cheek, really bring them to life. So, weaknesses, or anything I didn't like about the book? So like I said, the second half gets a bit of criticism, and I think it is crucial to the book, and it's very well done, but it is maybe just a little bit long-winded compared to the first half. And because the writing is more ordinary, it does feel like a bit of a downgrade. But again, that's kind of the point with Richard's romantic lens being stripped away. We see the ugly reality of everything. The only thing I really didn't like in the book, and this is pretty minor, is all that stuff about Julian and the fake Arab country. It felt a bit shoehorned in and out of place, as if there was some geopolitical point being made, but not very well. It was a bit strange, but not really a big deal. So in terms of the politics of the book, the themes it deals with, the ideas it explores, the list goes on and on. Youth, friendship, education, intellect, humanity, morality, violence, murder, guilt, class, identity, beauty, secrets, paranoia, superficiality, isolation, mythology, manipulation. It really is dense with ideas. So let's jump into some of that. Let's start by talking about the classics and the link between the classics and conservatism. Now, this may only be tangentially related to the text, but it has become such a cultural phenomenon in the decades since the book was published that I think it's worth mentioning. And I think some of it does apply to Henry and Francis and the others in terms of how the classics can be used as a signifier of certain values. So how did classical Greek antiquity become synonymous with these values? There's a book called Black Athena by Martin Bernal, which became quite controversial for some of its claims. The idea that ancient Greece had a lot of its roots in Egyptian and Semitic and Sumerian cultures, and that all of that had been excised later. That in the 18th and 19th centuries there was a concerted effort to quite literally whitewash ancient Greece. Now, I haven't read the book, so we won't get into those specific arguments, but this was during the glory days of Western imperialism, when it was very common for these ahistorical accounts to be invented and circulated in order to justify whatever atrocities were being committed. This has often been called the invention of tradition. And so we had this retconned image of classical Greece as the cradle of white civilization. And of course, one of the most striking examples was when the Nazis appropriated Plato and other classical Greek ideas to promote their Aryan ideology. Even now, if you ask the opinion of the chattering classes, academics and so on, many of them would tell you that there's a through line running from classical Greece, or more specifically from the activities of a small number of quite privileged people in one narrow period of Greek history, all the way to modern Western civilization and Western thought, whatever that's supposed to mean. David Graeber has a good essay that goes into this kind of specious idea of democracy having originated in Athens, and how our idea of the West that comes from that is completely incoherent. Anyway, these days it's got to the point where an image of a marble statue, for example, is basically a semiotic indicator used by a certain type of person to espouse certain values. You see a lot of this online. Lots of fascist adjacent stuff about culture and aesthetics and civilization. It's all about ascribing certain values to a group of people in the past, often ahistorically, and then saying that we should forego some of our modern progressive values because we don't like those, and we should act more like these guys, who I semi-invented and who in reality were pretty awful anyway. It's essentially an insidious way to encourage repealing the civil rights of certain groups of people. And there's a big overlap with the kind of nostalgia and trad ecosystems as well. You know, the people yearning for a simpler time, i.e. a more racist and sexist time. It's also part of the growing industry of masculinity, self-help content. You know, that kind of toxic astrology for men that's everywhere now. It's all very transactional, utilitarian, reactionary, all very conservative. So we get these kind of cynically reduced and degraded ideas and snippets and images from philosophy, architecture, whatever, and they all get appropriated as fodder in the culture war, disseminated as some kind of superficial framework of moral instruction, and then memed out into the world in an even more debased form by a bunch of racist chuds. And so you get these absurd dystopian conflations, like some crypto shilling sex pest telling you that Marcus Aurelius would never have let his girl have an OnlyFans. The guys falling for this dangerous nonsense are the same ones holding colour charts up to their TVs, investigating the whiteness of Netflix's latest fantasy TV show for 14-year-olds. And we get complaints like, hey, in the book this character wasn't black, why are they black in the TV show? Well, in the book the character was just words on a page. In a visual medium you have artistic interpretation, and art is informed by lots of societal and cultural factors, including movements that may try to redress the balance of a world that has, for generations of popular culture, presented whiteness as the default. I think my favourite element of all this is that even that idea of the white marble statue from classical Greece, this symbol of purity and cultivation and civilization, they were not at all as we think of them. They were often not white. Some of them were painted with realistic skin and hair tones. Others were garishly coloured, like a nativity scene from your primary school. Not only is this the perfect metaphor for how wrong all these reactionaries are about the whiteness of classical Greece, it's also just another way in which they're wrong about classical Greece. So let's move on to a related point, the dangers of intellectualism. When you look at Henry and the gang, their conception of intellect is at the core of everything that they do. It's central to the mythos that they've built up about themselves with Julian's help. It's crucial to their worldview and the way that they see other people. And it's the essence of their actions, their behaviour, their morality. So how do the gang see intellect, knowledge, education, essentially as things which bestow a kind of aesthetic, moral and material superiority? The gang effectively create their own moral code, and they dismiss a lot of, let's say, traditional morality. And this is based on their idea of superior intellect. At one point, the twins ask Henry how he can justify cold-blooded murder. Henry says he prefers to think of it as redistribution of matter. Okay, Henry. And then there's this line from Francis about the farmer, the victim of the first murder, which really sums up their attitude. It's a terrible thing, what we did. I mean, this man was not Voltaire we killed. But still, it's a shame. I feel bad about it. This man was not Voltaire. Then immediately after that, Henry suggests a nice game of cards. Not exactly racked with grief, are they? There are some quite funny scenes that centre on this obsession with intellect, like Henry poring over these dusty 15th century Persian texts to learn about the art of poisoning. And it's moments like this, as the story goes on, that reveal to us that maybe they're not quite as smart as they think. Near the end of the book, there's an interesting conversation between Charles and Richard, and Charles maintains that if Henry had been the one dealing with the FBI all along instead of Charles, they'd all be locked up. He says Henry is the type of person to worry about carrying the right book around to keep up this impression of nonchalance or whatever. But he would have no idea how to actually talk to the feds the way Charles did. Despite Richard's presentation of the gang as intellectuals, you really notice at times how ridiculous and childish they are. Like when Richard is asking them about the Bacchanal, the Dionysian ritual that started all this trouble. So Henry says, on the night of our first attempt, we simply overdrank and passed out in our chitons in the woods near Francis's house. And Richard asks him, you wore chitons? A chiton is that Greek-style tunic. Yes, said Henry, irritated. It was all in the interest of science. We made them from bed sheets in Francis's attic. Very scientific. Then you have the whole plan to flee to Argentina when they thought they were found out, which was not very well thought through. The gang are very intellectual in some ways, but they're not very intelligent, especially in the ways of the world. Another thing we see is that prioritizing intellect leads to isolation and alienation. What happens when you ignore emotional development and relationships and any kind of traditional morality? Look at all of the clumsy desire and jealousy that tears the gang gang apart in the second half of the book, along with the guild. Intellectualism and rationalism are very tempting, I think for men especially. It's easy to fall down the rabbit hole through something like atheism and then end up very quickly arriving at phrenology or something ridiculous. A lot of spurious social and political ideas have their roots in things like IQ, for example, a concept which is a classic case of scientific racism. And then you have the whole debate bro podcast scene, making all manner of specious arguments that ostensibly draw from and appeal to intellect and reason and common sense. To be clear, it is important, more than ever, to value science and logic and reason and facts. But there are a few issues with this. Firstly, a lot of dangerous, nonsensical ideological arguments are dressed up in the language of logic and reason. And then you get these rhetorical manipulations and sophistry, whether that's being selective with data, indulging in certain fallacies, or just lying. And the people who use these methods, and there are plenty of high-profile examples around at the moment, they manage to fool a lot of people. People who may have poor critical thinking skills or ideological bias, or are taken in by the rhetorical framework, or who just want to believe certain things that they hear from certain people. The second thing is, even if you are being objective and fair, insofar as it's possible, because biases always exist, it can be dangerous to apply only intellect to a problem and not, say, morality or empathy. Ultimately, what is intellect the result of? The books you've read, the classes you've taken, the conversations you've had, the knowledge you've acquired, the money spent on your education? And even then, what is it worth? In human terms, in moral terms, even in absolute material terms, is intellect valuable? The younger me might have said yes, but there comes a time in your life when you realize what's important. I like being a nerd and knowing useless trivia, and I like being into literature and language and history and science and all of that. But I don't confuse or conflate any of that with my self-worth as a person. For me, that comes from my relationships, the way I act, the way I treat people, my empathy, my values, my politics. If there's anything that we can loftily call wisdom, I believe it's a combination of knowledge and empathy. And often that empathy has to be gained from experiences, some of them difficult. Knowledge is easy to acquire, but empathy takes a lot more effort. And it can require re-evaluating your outlook, changing your opinions, admitting your faults, and other things that humans find uncomfortable and challenging. But I firmly believe that empathy is an essential counterbalance to logic and reason and intellect. And for a lot of people, particularly young men, either they take a long time to come to that realization, or they never come to it. Let's talk about class, as I'm sure I probably will in almost every video. Obviously, the setting of the novel is a fairly exclusive private school. Most of the main characters we meet are of that blue-blooded elite. Henry and the gang clearly have money, and that gives them privilege, freedom, resources, and influence, and it helps to insulate them from the real world. It's interesting to see the tension in the book between the gang and some of the ordinary working people who crop up. Of course, the main oppositional point here is our narrator, Richard, who's not a rich kid, and we'll talk about the act that he puts on in a minute. But you have other characters also who come in from outside this little elitist bubble that they live in, like the feds or the farmer, the latter being a fairly on-the-nose example of class conflict, considering what happens to him. There's a funny scene where they all end up talking to a waiter at a diner that's full of normie townsfolk, and Richard makes the observation that Henry and also Julian are good with common people. Yeah, I'm not too sure about that, Richard. I think maybe your patronizing radar is a bit off. I mean, Henry probably sees that waiter in the same way as you or I would see somebody's pet hamster. And as for Julian, there's a very telling line where he quotes Plato talking about justice and says that in an ideal society, everybody knows their place in the hierarchy and is happy with it. It's also mentioned at one point that Julian would always side with royalty over revolutionaries. No surprise there. There's a lot of talk about money in the novel, and particularly the generational wealth of the families of Henry and the others. You have Francis and Henry spending vast sums of money on Bunny, for example. Then there are the dismissive mentions by the gang of Bunny's family not really having any money left and just keeping up appearances. It's revealed that Julian lived off a trust fund back in his day, when he was living in Europe and rubbing shoulders with the in crowd, and that money is possibly what gave him the freedom to pursue a career sphere of obscure academia. People say money can't buy happiness, but of course it can. It can provide you with the conditions to be happy, affording you a life of freedom and leisure and choices that most people simply don't have. One of the other major class signifiers in the book is college education itself. The class divide between college-educated people and the rest is particularly acute in places like the US, where it's often lazily used as a thinly veiled indicator of somebody's worth, not just as a unit of labor to be utilized by capital, but as a human being. There's so much sociological and political and cultural baggage tied up in the idea of college education, of college as an institution that bestows this kind of social capital on people, and that allows you access to a higher tier of living standards, among other things. When we look at some of the characters in the book, their attendance at a college like Hampton is ironic because they don't really need to be there. And obviously most of the people who would benefit from that leg up can't afford to be there. That's the catch-22 of private education and other institutions of privilege. A lot of these rich college kids are just fulfilling a social norm or passing the time. Richard recognizes this when it looks like he might crash out of college because of Julian leaving. And he feels a real bitterness towards the others because for them, college doesn't really matter. They're going to land on their feet regardless. Although ultimately the gang's money doesn't stop them from being miserable. And we'll come back to that later when we talk about the effects of the murder on them. Another part of the class equation in the novel is the concept of identity. How do we present ourselves to the world and how do people see us? Especially if there is a class difference there, or if we find ourselves somewhere that we feel we don't really belong, where we're terrified of being found out. This is how Richard feels at Hampton, and pretty much everything he does in the book is a result of his insecurities. Now, a lot of people probably reinvent themselves a little bit when they go to a new school or to college or whatever, but Richard takes it a little bit further. He creates a whole new family history and persona, essentially, to try to fit in, or just to try to fully escape or erase the life that he had in California. In the first dozen pages of the book, Richard goes into detail about the poverty of his childhood. He says there was little of interest and less of beauty, that he felt his existence was tainted in some subtle but essential way. He says, "My years there created for me an expendable past, disposable as a plastic cup. On leaving home, I was able to fabricate a new and far more satisfying history." Richard even lies to Julian about his past, and he remarks to the reader that lying on his feet is the only thing he's ever been good at. Richard mentions having gone to med school before this, and he makes it very clear that his only motivator was money. And later, when Bunny is needling Richard about all kinds of things, it's only when he mentions Richard's family and poverty that he really gets a response. So what does all of this behavior point to? Shame. Richard is ashamed of his origins, which is obviously one of the reasons why he's so attracted to the gang and why he wants to be a part of it so badly. Because then he'll be like them, he thinks, insulated from material problems. And so he pretends to be like them. But the saddest part about Richard's pretense is that it just doesn't work. Henry and the others see through it. They clearly know that he's not like them, he's just a regular guy, and they manipulate him throughout the novel. Bunny compares Richard to the drug dealer character Cloak at one stage, and Richard takes great offense at this, being likened to this rather dim, ordinary character. And then you have that rather pathetic detail at the end that the doctor, whom Richard had worked for the entire year, didn't even know Richard's name. So the lesson is, don't be a class traitor, Richard. Such bourgeois aspirations will only lead you astray. Oh, and also don't be a murderer. So, two lessons, I guess. Let's talk about aesthetics and beauty. So, much like the classics in general, or particularly concepts like Stoicism, for example, there are some really worthwhile and interesting elements to the concepts of aesthetics and beauty. They are expressions of our humanity and creativity. They are integral to nature, and they're intrinsically connected to things like attraction and love and art and lots of other essentially human things. And I think there are many benefits of valuing beauty over mere utilitarianism in a lot of different areas. But ideas like aesthetics and beauty and stoicism and architecture and art and so on can be warped. They can be vulgarized, appropriated, and otherwise manipulated into something less natural, less positive, less human. In the case of aesthetics and beauty, I suppose the debasement of that we see in the modern world is maybe a tendency towards superficiality, the commodification and commercialization of beauty, a resurgence emergence of patriarchal expressions of sexual politics, etc. But let's look at the treatment of it in the novel. Richard's narration is very focused on aesthetics. You have that opening line from him about his longing for the picturesque, and we see examples of that. Often when there's some sort of drama or action happening, Richard is fixated instead on some visual detail, the sky or the trees or a building or snowfall, and there are some really beautiful passages in there. Here's one example. It was one of those mysterious, oppressive days we sometimes had at Hampton, where the mountains that lowered at the horizon were swallowed up in fog, and the world seemed light and empty, dangerous somehow. Walking around campus, the wet grass squishing beneath your feet, you felt as if you were in Olympus, Valhalla, some old abandoned land above the clouds. The landmarks that you knew, clock tower, houses, floating up like memories from a former life, isolated and disconnected in the mist. So we know that Richard likes beautiful, picturesque things, but what about the others? And how does this relate to their actions, and what does it reveal about them as people? Well, to dig into that, let's discuss one of the most famous lines from the book, "Beauty is terror." This comes up quite early in the novel during one of Julian's classes. Henry says, "Death is the mother of beauty." Julian asks him, "And what is beauty?" To which Henry replies, "Terror." And then Julian goes on and rhapsodizes about this a little bit, as is his wont. It's a very Greek idea, and a very profound one. Beauty is terror. Whatever we call beautiful, we quiver before it. And what could be more terrifying and beautiful to souls like the Greeks, or our own, than to lose control completely? To throw off the chains of being for an instant, to shatter the accident of our mortal selves, to sing, to scream, to dance barefoot in the woods in the dead of night, with no more awareness of mortality than an animal. These are powerful mysteries. The bellowing of bulls, springs of honey bubbling from the ground. If we are strong enough in our souls, we can rip away the veil and look that naked, terrible beauty right in the face. Let God consume us, devour us, unstring our bones, then spit us out, reborn. I'm not going to lie, when I was an impressionable, pretentious teenager, if I'd had this guy filling my head with that kind of stuff, there is every chance I could end up having a Dionysian orgy in a cave. And we'll come back to that shortly, talking about Julian's influence and his responsibility. But for the moment, let's examine Julian's idea that beauty is terror. This is very similar to Edmund Burke's idea about the sublime. So, beauty is terror. It's a snappy quote, and there is something tantalizing about it. But once you examine it, I think it falls apart pretty quickly, and I think that is deliberate from Tartt. This is just edgelord, pseudo-profound nonsense, and I think it reveals a lot about Julian and the gang, though at least they have the excuse of being young and suggestible. It reminded me of the Yeats line from Easter 1916, "A terrible beauty is born." And sometimes, yes, there can be beauty in terrible things. Maybe because those things are rare, or striking, or emotionally resonant, or whatever. Watching a predator make a kill on a nature documentary, to give a fairly banal example. But of course, not all beauty is terrible. There are many beautiful things in this world that don't evoke any kind of terror. And I think this kind of dogmatic, contrarian epigram, this kind of glib attempt by Julian to channel Heraclitus or Oscar Wilde or Chuang Tzu or someone like that, it tells us that Julian is bored. He's bored with ordinary people and things and emotions and experiences, probably because of his comfort and privilege, or because he's read a bit too much about the Greeks or whatever. And so he has to indulge in this kind of performatively subversive way of thinking. So this kind of grandiose declaration from Julian really just tells us how tedious he finds the world that he inhabits. This is a man who says he doesn't find his students interesting because he already knows what they're going to do with their lives. Who, as Richard notes, is, along with Henry, firmly embedded in Greece, not in the real world. Julian even invokes this idea himself as he begins his classes. "I hope we're all ready to leave the phenomenal world and enter into the sublime." What a dick. So here we have the idea of reality versus illusion. Julian and the gang are living in a fantasy of their own making, where they can live forever and experience terrible beauty and beautiful terror, and nothing ordinary or regular will ever darken their door, because they're simply too important, too intellectual for that kind of banality. It's all just juvenile escapism. It's a game to Julian, who even says that what they do in his classes is play, not work. So let's bring it back to how this is revealed through aesthetics. We have that scene where everybody is out searching for Bunny, and Julian and Henry are delighted at how dramatic and operatic this is. Henry says it's like something from Tolstoy, and Julian agrees. There's no recognition from either of them of the substance of the situation, the material reality, the emotional impact. No humanism or empathy, just a cold eye for the beauty of terror. Richard tells us that the first sentence he learned in Greek was, "Beauty is harsh." Why is beauty harsh for Richard? Because it's unattainable? After all, he spends the whole book lusting after Camilla and he doesn't get anywhere. We've all been there. Beauty can make us miserable. But it's not just Camilla. Richard falls for the aesthetic of the gang in general. Late in the novel, Richard says that he had liked the idea of the murder binding them together, but now he's getting sick of them and he's stuck with them. And Francis mentioned something interesting a few pages earlier, that he has this habit of seeing physical beauty in people, like a moody pair of eyes, he says, and then ascribing attributes to those people that they simply don't have, imagining all sorts of deep affinities and private kinships. Again, relatable. But now we can see that Richard did something similar with the gang. He was taken in by their aesthetic, by the idea of them. Like that early quote about them swanning around campus dressed in white. Sophisticated, mysterious, alluring. But the reality of them is a different story. And that is the terrible thing about beauty. It can blind us to the truth. So let's get into the final point, morality. The central moral question of the novel revolves around a murder. Much like Crime and Punishment, a book which is actually mentioned twice in the text and which clearly had some influence on it. We've already talked about intellect and how all of the delusions that go along with that can warp somebody's moral code. But let's focus more specifically on the material actions of the characters and the morality of those actions. We'll look at a few key concepts here: influence, action and inaction, responsibility, and consequences. So firstly, influence. The obvious person to talk about here is Julian, the gang's teacher, tutor, counselor, high priest, philosopher king. You get the idea. Julian is such a well-drawn character. He has a lot of traits that I recognize in people who I've met over the years, particularly in academic or arty settings. All that affected charm and self-indulgent pretension, but with occasional glimpses of a real coldness or even nastiness behind that facade. While reading the novel, I pictured him as kind of a youngish Derek Jacobi, although Derek Jacobi seems to look about 60 years old for a period of about 50 years. So Julian has set himself up as an outsider at Hampton, and he seeks out a small number of acolytes among other outsiders, essentially so that he can mold them in his image and inculcate his own opinions and values into them. That would be the uncharitable way to view the relationship. I suppose you could argue that he just wants to teach them about the classics and influence their lives in a positive way through philosophy and so on. But I think the way he's presented, it is more of the former than the latter. I think we are supposed to see him as quite manipulative. And we mentioned how powerful his rhetoric is to these impressionable young people. The fact that he deliberately isolates them from the rest of the student body is also a bit dodgy. He says that having a diversity of teachers is harmful and confusing. Is this just his justification for having complete control over his little regiment, as Richard calls them? The epigraph at the midpoint of the book is about Dionysus, who could enable his votaries, his followers, to see the world as the world is not. And for me, that sums up Julian's influence on the gang, pulling them into an alternate world where things like morality are very different, and where the material concerns of the real world don't have any purchase. Richard mentions the gang being nervous when they would put on these black tie dinners for Julian. You really get the sense of that dynamic, that they worship him. Everybody probably had a teacher or some kind of adult in their younger days who inspired those kind of feelings. And it's a vulnerable position for the young person to be in, and it requires a lot of responsibility and good judgment on the part of the adult. Julian is shown to be particularly close to Henry. Henry calls him a divinity in our midst, and they're often seen having intimate chats. Although even Richard says that he saw Julian as his protector, the sole figure of paternal benevolence or any benevolence in his life. So what happens when Julian learns the truth about what the gang have done? He runs away. When confronted with the result of all of his provocative fantasizing and his fancy rhetoric, Julian just ups and leaves, much to the bitterness of Henry in particular. particular. Now, Julian obviously never directly encouraged the gang to do violence, as far as we know, although he did know about the bacchanals they were having. But he presumably feels somewhat responsible for what happened, and he's afraid that there might be consequences for him. And suddenly, this is not a game anymore, it's all too real for him, and he flees. He abandons the gang when they need him most, which is hardly in keeping with his lofty philosophizing about duty and ethics and everything else. Now, he also doesn't turn them in, which I guess you could argue both ways as well. I suppose that shows some loyalty and affection to the gang, but not to Bunny. Late in the book, Richard has realized that Julian only saw in them the parts that he wished to cultivate, and he ignored the rest. That Julian had a gift for latching on to young people who felt inferior, and twisting that feeling into one of superiority. And Richard says that Julian did this for his own egotistical reasons. But Richard can't bring himself to condemn him, and he clearly still has a lot of affection for him. I think a lot of it comes down to charisma, that lovely old Greek word for one who has been blessed by the gods with a power. So many people who are cruel, abusive, manipulative, whatever, if they have enough charisma, they can often get away with it. Charisma is essentially an aesthetic quality, not a material one. And it's just one of the facts of the human condition that we can be deeply influenced by such people. The other person to mention in terms of influence is, of course, Henry. He is very much the de facto leader of the gang, the lieutenant to Julian's general, if you like. Henry is the one who comes up with the plan and outlines it to the gang, and then he calmly responds to their concerns and assuages their fears with his rational explanations. Henry is also charismatic in his way, and he is quite clearly a much more dangerous influence than Julian, even if he's in a position of less institutional responsibility, let's say. And of course, Henry plays the main part in the murder, which brings us to action and inaction. So in terms of action, it's pretty simple. Henry commits the murder. He's the one who pushes Bunny off the cliff. He's consistently the most resolved of the gang, and if you removed him from the story, the others would never have done what he did, I don't believe. Henry says his life truly began the day he killed Bunny. He calls him that man. Now he can live without thinking. Now he knows that he can do anything he wants. So yeah, Henry is probably a sociopath and definitely a cold-blooded murderer. But what about the others? They all helped to plan it. They were all there when it happened. Charles is maybe the only other person who plays a very active role by lying to the feds. For Francis, Camilla, and particularly Richard, their major role in all of this is one of inaction, which of course can be just as immoral as action in certain cases. Let's talk about Richard's passivity. I suppose we never really figure out why Richard is so passive, if it's just his insecurity or his upbringing or whatever. But in any case, Richard spends the whole book observing everything. First, he observes from a distance, and then even when he's firmly enmeshed in the action, he continues to speak as if from a distance, with this kind of wide-angle, picturesque lens of everything, focusing on the aesthetics as if he's a bystander and not an active participant. He's willfully passive and he doesn't take responsibility for anything. And he goes along with the whole murder, even though he won't be incriminated by Bunny like the others for the murder of the farmer. So why does Richard do it? Okay, Bunny treated him badly, but the jump from that to murder is wild, or would be for most people. Eventually, Richard comes to the conclusion that Henry let him find out about the first murder. Richard says, maybe he had divined in me correctly this cowardice, this hideous pack instinct which would enable me to fall into step without question. And 24 hours after that, Bunny was dead. Richard watched it happen. And I think that Richard is spot on here. I think cowardice is the name for it. That's really what sums up Richard as a person, moral cowardice. That's your fatal flaw, Richard, not that other bollocks about a longing for the picturesque. So that brings us to the question of moral responsibility. Richard says, for the record, that he doesn't consider himself an evil person. He says that none of them were. It was his weakness, it was Henry's hubris, etc., but not evil. The word evil is often used to other immoral acts, to set them apart as something animalistic or insane or fantastical, as if some malicious dark spirit inhabits somebody's mind, bending their will, forcing them to do horrible things. And often that kind of terminology can be used simply to abdicate any personal responsibility, or to distract from the fact that human beings often make conscious decisions to do terrible things. There are always excuses. The gang are young, they were influenced by Julian, they're all a bit neurodivergent, some of them had shitty parents. And you can sympathize with them for some of those things until they decide to commit murder. Because ultimately they're adults and they each make a conscious choice to act or not to act. So who does the responsibility lie with ultimately? Richard says late in the book that it seemed crucial at the time that he hadn't been the one to push Bunny off the cliff, but that now it doesn't really matter. And he's right, it doesn't matter. Richard is responsible for the murder. They all are. Henry, Charles, Camilla, Francis, and Richard. Julian? Maybe, to a tenuous extent. You can definitely question his motives and his morality and his manipulations. Was he a contributing factor, an accelerant? Yes. But can you blame him for the murder? Hard to say. I don't think so, but I don't think I'm fully decided on that. Is Bunny partially to blame for his own murder? No. Did he behave horribly? Yes. Does that mean he deserved to be summarily executed? Of course not. Which brings us finally to the consequences of this immoral act. The epigraph to the epilogue, that's very Greek, is a wonderfully scathing line from John Ford. Alas, poor gentleman, he looked not like the ruins of his youth, but like the ruins of those ruins. And that's the condition of the gang by the end of the book, in ruins. Because the major product of the moral equation of the novel is guilt. And we see the effects of this guilt, starting with Bunny's funeral, and then carrying on until the dramatic events at the end of the book. Each member of the gang goes off the rails in a slightly different way. Paranoia, violence, substance abuse, suicide. It's all there and it all unfolds painfully and inevitably. And what of Richard? We get a brief tacked on mention of an uncommunicative, failed relationship. We get a short note on his academic focus, the Jacobean dramatists, who he says deal with sin unpunished, innocence destroyed, something beautiful and wicked that trickled beneath the surface of mortality. He hasn't changed, has he? And we see him seeking out stories of other murderers, looking for lurid details and explanations. Maybe he's trying to figure out why he did what he did. He even calls one of the murderers a colleague. The murder of Bunny dominates Richard's life at the expense of everything else. As he says at the beginning of the novel about being up on the cliff that day of the murder, I have come to realize that while for years I might have imagined myself to be somewhere else, in reality, I have been there all the time. And he goes on to say, I suppose at one time in my life I might have had any number of stories, but now there is no other. This is the only story I will ever be able to tell. At the very end of the book, Richard dreams about Henry. He is still under his spell. There's a scene late in the novel where a violent altercation involving Charles and Camilla leads to a mirror being smashed. And I think that's a fitting symbolic image for the consequences of murder, for the effects of this guilt. The gang's image of themselves has been shattered by the reality of what they did. Wherever he ended up, I think Julian would probably have taken some grim satisfaction in such a dramatic ending. Truly worthy of a Greek tragedy. Okay, that's it for The Secret History, one of my favorite books. I hope you enjoyed that. Remember, if you want more content, you can check out my Patreon page. At the moment, 50% of my videos are going up there, and that will probably increase in the future. You can read more about that on the Patreon page if you like. So, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care of yourselves. Good luck.